Recently, I've watched a few interviews with Alan Chapman where he has been talking about Aleister Crowley's life and work, and it made me recognise a serious flaw in my own character about how I respond to controversial figures, both in magic and in other areas of culture. If you've been in the magical space or the occult space for any length of time, you've probably heard of Aleister Crowley, and you've probably heard what a divisive figure, that he was a quote-unquote awful person, he treated people really badly, and I've no doubt that some of the things that I've heard about him were true. But what I mistakenly did, and what I wrongly did, was that I wrote off his teachings to the point that I decided not to read any of his books because of what I'd heard about him. All across history, there are people who have been hugely talented all across the cultural spectrum, and at the same time some of them have done awful things. And I think one of the questions that comes out of that is, can we still appreciate what the person produced, created, in spite of how they behaved? And I don't necessarily know if there's a blanket answer to that. I think that's something we've got to come to ourselves, or maybe it depends on the person, i.e. the artist or the magician, if we're sticking with magic. So I wrote off Aleister Crowley's teachings. I mean, that was one mistake, but one of the mistakes that even preceded that was that I believed what I read and saw online about Aleister Crowley without doing my own investigating. I just took these things to be true. But then when I watched some recent interviews where Alan Chapman was talking about Aleister Crowley, I started to realise that some of this image that was portrayed about Aleister Crowley was manufactured to maybe give him more publicity, give him more attention, and Aleister Crowley himself was involved in that. So in a way, he kind of created that, but I suspect that it came back to bite him. And of course, we see that today. Nothing has changed in that sense. But starting to see the nuance in this person, Aleister Crowley, if I had have done this in the first place, I probably would have found a more balanced perspective about Aleister Crowley. And the second mistake I made was then writing off Aleister Crowley and deciding I didn't want to read anything that he'd said or done with regards to magic, because he was a quote-unquote awful person, and therefore there is nothing I can learn from his teachings. This sort of thing continues to this day. There are still controversies surfacing about people in the occult, and at those times there are a lot of people that decide to boycott that person's work. And I do understand this. I myself do find it hard sometimes to separate the quote-unquote art from the artist, but I do wonder, is it possible to appreciate someone's work when we know that they've done awful things, or maybe we see as going against social norms or cultural norms? And like I say, I don't know if there is an answer, and there may be some people who are very clear in their mind about this. Yes, that is absolutely awful, we should boycott, and there are others on the other end of the spectrum who say no. But I suppose what I'm trying to encourage in this video and this reflection is encourage nuance and a willingness to sit within the grey area of these things. I think what has happened with social media is often what we see and hear are the extreme ends of the debates or the opinions that get put forward about certain situations. And that's one of the reasons why I've stepped away so much from social media. Not because I don't care about what's going on, but because all I was seeing was the extreme viewpoints. And I found myself sitting in those extremes, but then getting very confused when I would listen to somebody with an extreme view on one thing and think, well, I'm not sure I agree with that, but I do agree with what they said about this. And then hearing someone on the other end of the kind of viewpoint, if you like, and saying the same thing about them, disagreeing with them on some things they were saying and agreeing on others, and tying myself up in knots thinking, well, where do I fit? What is my view on this? My main concern, I think, reflecting on myself and how I responded to what I thought I knew about Aleister Crowley, and you know, I'm sure there are plenty of things I still don't know, and who knows which of it is true and which is not. But the problem is, if we decide to reject people's work on the basis of their actions, we may risk missing out on some learning that is valuable to us and our magical practice. And now if you're happy to do that, if you're okay that you might miss out on that, you might miss out on some learning because you don't want to associate yourself with someone's work, that's fine. I think we all have decisions to make. I think the main thing is that we're conscious about that decision. We understand that by making that decision, that might be a consequence of that. And if we're okay with that, fine. My personal experience was that I did this almost without realising it. It was only when I heard more about Aleister Crowley that I realised, maybe I should give his writings a chance. I'm not saying that I need to read everything that he wrote, but that contrasted with some of the things that he did, it seems as though he was a very adept magician. He knew what he was doing, and there are some things that I can learn from him. Maybe some things I can learn what to do, and certainly plenty of what not to do by the sound of it. So in terms of what I've learned from hearing and reading about the controversies surrounding Aleister Crowley and my close-mindedness about that, I've learned that I need to try and remain open to the grey area, to the nuances, to not believe everything that I read and that I see, to dig deeper if I want to find out more about a person. And even if I want to reject them as a person or reject their behaviours, I can still be open to their work in terms of finding something useful from it. And if I don't find anything useful from it, then all I've done is lost some time reading their material. If I had have remained open to finding a more balanced perspective of the man behind the character that was Aleister Crowley, or the character that was portrayed by himself and the media and the people around him, if I'd have remained a bit more open, I might have read his work sooner. I might have been willing to read his work sooner. So that's just some reflections on my own process, but let me know if that's affected you too, whether social media has made it harder to sit within that nuance, that uncertainty, that grey area. I'd love to hear what you've got to say. Take good care, be well, and I will speak to you again soon.